Hi, and welcome to another video of Aperture Speaks. Today, actually, I want to talk about exposure compensation and all the different sort of things that can come along with that. And so I'll just sort of start with this image you have here of a sunset. Now, this was captured last weekend. It wasn't actually captured this weekend, it was last weekend. And the reason I'm talking about exposure compensation is I was watching a video by another photographer who was asked a question about exposure compensation, and his answer wasn't actually very clear. So I'm sort of just going to try and give a clearer idea of what exposure compensation is and how it can be used. So exposure compensation really is when you take a photograph and the exposure is compensated. And what I mean with this is that another two pictures are taken, one which is underexposed and one which is overexposed. So if we just jump to the film strip view here, this would have been the original exposure of the sunset, and you can see here that the sun is completely blown out, but you do have some quite nice details here in the sky. And I think actually if we go to one of the ones that I actually got the city in there like this, this would have been the base exposure here, and you can see some details here in the building. It's not actually that much when you actually get down into it. Yeah, it's not that much. You know, you can see, you can make out the windows really. And what I had here was an exposure of actually 3 stops. It was a 3 stops compensation. And so this was the one which was underexposed, and here you get a bit more detail inside, and here it's completely out. This is completely blown out. Actually, I think it must have been quite a long shutter speed because I actually got a bit of camera shakes there. So you can actually see, you know, in this one we call this nice bird, a silhouette of the bird here. But here's a better one with the city on the under. So how does exposure compensation work? Well, first of all, you have to turn it on. Depending on your camera, you can turn it on in different ways. Now, if I'm looking at my camera here, I actually go into the menu on my camera and set the exposure compensation. Other ones have this sort of plus from a line, then minus, and you can then press that and move the exposure compensation as well. The exposure compensation will work in your program mode, your shutter speed priority mode, and your aperture priority mode. It will not work in manual mode. And one of the reasons it won't work in manual mode is because you can do the compensation manually. The camera won't do it manually. I think the only thing I did have on what you can do is you can actually automatically set the exposure to go 1 stop over or 1 stop under, and you can actually have that on all modes. On most cameras, I know my G10 did it. I know my 300D did it. I know the 60D does it. You have to go into the menu and actually find it on the digital SLRs. On the G10, it's actually on the top. You can actually maneuver this around as well. Why do it? That's for the next question. Well, there's a few reasons. I have used exposure compensation from my film days, and I used to shoot a lot of film. And I used to do it then manually. I didn't have an auto film camera. I had a fully manual film camera. And I did it then just to safeguard my metering. You can take a meter reading of something, and your meter reading may be slightly out. And what the exposure compensation does is if you are slightly out, it can give you an image which is possibly closer to the exposure than what you originally took. So if you took a picture which was and you exposed it, and everything is gone, you know, it's way overexposed from your exposure reading, your underexposure should have captured the correct exposure, and then the same way over as well. So it's a way of safeguarding the shot, really. Some of the reasons for doing it is when the background is a lot brighter than your foreground. And if your object is in the foreground but the background is really bright, when you take your meter reading, it would the metering would probably compensate the differences by exposing more for the brightness of the background, which could leave your subject in the foreground very, very dark. So if we take the example that this was my skyline shot here, and I wanted all this here, I wanted to have the correctly exposed. This is my subject. On a normal exposure, this is completely shadow, because it's taken into consideration this background. But here, the background is blown out, but this is here, is nearer the correct exposure. So that's the sort of idea with it. I think sunsets are quite interesting to look at when you're looking at exposure compensation, and once again here as well. So that's why it happened. That's why you can use it. You can use it vice versa, but your subject is in the background's a lot darker in your foreground, and you can use the compensation to sort of try and get it close as you can. Another thing you can actually use it for is when you need to shoot quite quickly. But if you're going to be like, your exposure is maybe at a 60th of a second, and you know that the thing is going to be completely blurred. Maybe if you underexpose by one stop, you'll be about 100th of a second. Maybe push it to 125th. Yes, your picture will be underexposed, but you can then make some slight adjustments in Adobe Camera Raw or in Lightroom just to bring that exposure back up a little bit. When you shoot for shutter speed, what happens is that the shutter speed doesn't change because the camera is set to take the picture at that shutter speed. It compensates the exposure with the aperture. Now this means that if you are right at the ends of your apertures, I'm talking about you're either at the 1.8, aperture 3, 5.6, these are usually the lower ends, or if you're up at f22, you are gonna not get the exposure either over or the exposure under, because the aperture won't be able to go that way. So if you're going to use shutter speed, you have to make sure that the normal exposure is in a middle-ish aperture. So there's actually one aperture down or one aperture over the top, depending on how many stops you're going to go. So if you're going to go one stop over, one stop under, this will be one aperture stop up, one aperture stop down. If you're going to go two aperture stops up, two aperture stops down. I usually shoot on aperture priority mode because I like to have control of the depth of field and the depth of focus with my images. I don't really mind a little bit of blurring if something in the background is moving, as long as it doesn't actually interfere with the picture so much. If you're taking a picture of someone running, of course, probably aperture is going to be more important. The shutter speed is going to be more important for you. So I use an aperture priority mode, and so then plus minus, it moves the shutter speed. So once again, you have to think, what is going to be the lowest shutter speed? And I think I showed the blurry picture here, where this was shot out and it's over and it's blurred because the camera shutter speed was too long. Now normally they say that if you are shooting on a lower shutter speed, your shutter speed should be no longer than the focal length of your lens. So if you're shooting on a 50mm lens, this means you can't really shoot longer than a 50th of a second. Now, that's a rule of thumb, mind you. That really is a rule of thumb. But you have to think about also your lens on your camera. If you have a lens for a full frame camera, and you've got it on a CMOS censored camera, which are usually 1.4 or 1 times 1.4 times 1.6. If you're at 50mm, when you times 1.6, you're going to be over 60. So you have to think a little bit about this as well. I hope you've enjoyed the video and learning a little bit about exposure compensation. Do use it. It's actually a really good tool that we have in our belt, especially when it comes to creating images and using it in a creative way to get the best image possible without wasting a lot of shots and creating shots which really are wasted and can be better in the other way around. You can catch me on my blog, which is aperture64.wordpress.com. You can also follow me on Twitter, which is @aperture64, and I'm also on Facebook, facebook.com/aperture64. Until next week, I hope you have a great week, and get out there and get shooting. Bye-bye.